Hello, I'm Harry Riley. Welcome to Harry's Tales. I enjoyed writing them and hope you enjoy them too. This is called A Bird's Eye View. It's a humorous story for pigeon fanciers by Harry Riley. This is fiction and resemblance to any person living or dead is coincidental. Kelvin Osborne was the son of a Derbyshire farmer, inheriting the farm after his father died suddenly, being gored by his pride and joy, a bad-tempered bull called Seymour. Kevin could understand how the bull should be bad-tempered with a name like that. He hadn't been fond of his father and was not interested in farming, but he did like the peace and quiet of the country, like having the solitude to pursue his special interests. In short, these were his homing pigeons and rocket building. Not just any old rocket, oh no, he wanted a rocket to blast him off into space, where his true destiny lay, to orbit the Earth and then later, who knows, outer space and the galaxies, exploring the far reaches of the unknown. His intention was not to go into space alone. He would take Trekki, his favourite pigeon, with him. Trekki was a beautiful bird, a swift and elegant flyer. Trekki understood him best. He thought they shared an affinity with the heavens, the way Trekki looked and cooed and listened to him cooing back when he was stroking her feathers and rubbing the back of her neck. He thought he could teach her to talk the way budgies and parrots can. He'd shown her his latest rocket, built after several failures, and had tried to explain to her she would be going up there with him, higher and faster than any pigeon had ever travelled before. He'd lavished money from his inheritance on the latest state-of-the-art computer equipment and avidly followed NASA's developments. All his leisure time was spent working on this project. He'd installed a giant satellite dish so he could communicate and interact with his base computer once in orbit. And now at last he'd made all his preparations, and tomorrow at 7 a.m. he'd press the button to eject him from this earth and thrust him up through the clouds, setting him amongst the gods, where only a select few had ever been. Men like his Russian heroes, Gagarin and Krunov, and the Americans, Scherer, Glenn and Aldrin, men who dared to embrace the stars and returned home just like Trekki always did. He was pent up with emotion and couldn't sleep that night as he watched his bedside clock ticking slowly through the dark hours. He wondered if Trekki had any inkling of the history she would be making tomorrow. Up there he would have all the time in the world to teach Trekki to talk. There were no women in Kelvin's life, nobody to mourn him if things went wrong. He thought that was good. He'd given away his other pigeons to the local fanciers club, and now he was ready to go. Next morning dawned bright, final checks were made, and Kelvin was set to boldly go. Trekki was secured in her special seat by his side with a fine chain attached to her tiny leg band and had a plentiful supply of food to last for a full week in orbit. She would be fed twice a day with her favourite mix of field peas, groats, red millet and grass seed. He had a large container of fresh boiled water, so he was content Trekki would have enough food and water to sustain her on this flight. He'd packed his own food to last him a week also. He was curious to know how Trekki would behave in orbit. He'd read that pigeons can hear sounds much lower than the human ear can detect, and that they possess a sort of psychic navigation that gets them home. He'd resolved to keep an audio diary sent back via the computer as he travelled through space, recording the journey. Now, press the big red button and bang, they were away. Takeoff was faultless, and with everything going to plan, he was soon out of the Earth's atmosphere and trimming the craft to go into orbit. He planned to do a few orbits and then come back down again for his first trip. Nobody had been told about this project, but that didn't matter because he was confident his flight would have been monitored by satellite and that NASA would be fully aware of his movements anyway. What a fantastic view he had of the Earth below. It was truly a bird's eye view. He released Trekki so she could enjoy the flight, and at the same time started the first of his audio recordings. He was delighted when Trekki started squawking and cooing. "Hello, Trekki, who's a pretty girl then?" He repeated the words over and over again, but to no avail. The stubborn bird would not speak. It would all take time. After all, she had only a small head with a pea-sized brain. Still, at least he was in orbit. He'd been correct in all his calculations. The voyage was a wonderful triumph. Then, just at the moment when the warm glow of success was welling up inside him, things started going drastically wrong. His computers began to malfunction. He must not panic. He twiddled a few knobs and did one or two elementary tests, but had no response. The rocket swung violently out of orbit and headed off into space. He was knocked unconscious and must have been out for several minutes, coming round to find he was heading straight for a big black hole. He knew it was not as close as it looked and that it would take him several days to plunge into its bottomless depths. But there was nothing he could do. He was trapped, and once food and drink and air were exhausted, both he and Trekki would die a lonely and agonising death. How could he have been such a silly fool? After 4 days with the black hole filling his vision, his food had gone and he was feeling light-headed. Trekki, though, still had a lot of grains, and Kelvin began to look longingly at them and decided to try a sample. Oh, they were quite good. He tried some more, and soon was cramming great big handfuls down his throat. Far, far away, back in a little attic on Earth, sat a schoolboy at his sophisticated computer equipment. Dudley Franklin was trying to achieve his ambition, the ambition of other misguided schoolboys to hack into NASA's controls. He was streets ahead of his classmates and seemed to have a special knack of knowing how to break codes and passwords. Today he'd been unsuccessful and was about to give up when he heard a strange noise. It was a cooing sound. A pigeon must have got lost and found its way into his parents' loft. He looked around and then realised the sound was coming from his computer speakers. And then through the crackle he heard a man's voice, a voice with a decidedly Derbyshire accent. "Who's a pretty girl then? Who's a pretty girl? Come on, you stupid bird, speak to me." Try as he might, young Dudley couldn't improve on the quality of sound. It must be coming from a very long way off. For 2 more nights he tried to link up to the strange messenger, and eventually floating across the airwaves came a thin, reedy voice. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Can anyone hear me? I need help. My name is Trekki, and I am lost in space with a crazy fool who scoffed all his own grub and is picking himself silly on mine." The voice stopped speaking, and all he could hear was dual cooing until it faded away. End.